Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to learn more about the post-pandemic soul, the fundraiser that 1128 is putting on to support our work with women in ministry. We are so excited to welcome Zeena Regis, who is a grief chaplain and who will be a part of our panel discussion alongside Dr. Jennifer Shoemaker and Amy Bose-Tiniger as we talk about the mental and spiritual impact of the pandemic on us thus far, as well as going ahead. So welcome, Zeena. I'm so glad that you are here. I'd love to hear you talk for just a minute about your experience in the pandemic and what has that been like for you?
Yes, I'm so happy to be here. It has been, so I've been thinking a lot about like how it looks in hospice. I just had someone ask me like, how is it, and how is the pandemic in hospice care? Um, and so it's been such a grief and end of life are already isolating occurrences in our life, in our culture. Um, it's just even in the best of times, people find that the isolation of grief is just. I'm so sorry about that. My dog's in the background. Um, it's just terrible. It's a time where people are pulling away for a variety of reasons, and so to have that complicated by the pandemic and have people um, really isolated has been difficult, and it's really changed the way that I do spiritual care. And it's really helped me to redefine what is presence, because so much of my care as a chaplain has been about presence, the ministry of presence, what it looks like. And so I've really had to think differently about how to be present in this time. But that has informed the way I do everything. Like, what does presence really mean? So, yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk more about that. What does presence really mean? I think you're right. It is such a huge concept and experience for all of us in the last year. Say more about that, please.
Yeah. So at first I was like, so much of what I do is body language and holding hands and being close and just in silence. So I've learned very quickly in this post-pandemic world or current pandemic world that silence on Zoom is not the holy full experience that it can be in person. So actually people are like, what is happening? Are you frozen? Like, why are we silent? So I really had to one, just communicate more and communicate differently about what we're doing in this space, and creating group norms in a different way when I do support groups, and creating kind of one-on-one norms in different ways. A lot of presence has also been, for me, especially in hospice work, is equipping the people who are able to be at the bedside. So what does that look like? So doing a lot of spiritual care for healthcare workers that are there, doing and being their chaplain a lot of times when I am not able to be at the bedside of a person who is dying, because they are seeing it in a way that I am not. So um, so it's been a lot of that, like really being creative, helping people with ritual, because that is something that we're really missing in this time, is like ritual and gathering. And so just being as creative as possible when it comes to determining what is ritual and how can we do a ritual virtually and that kind of stuff. And so just really, and also making myself get comfortable with silence on the phone and telling people like that's okay, like we don't have to talk, we can just be there, but just that connection is important. So just all of the ways of being like reimagining what support looks like when I can't take someone a casserole or hold their hand or um, bring them whatever I would typically bring. And so that's been really interesting to think about. I've even done some things like one of the things that I have found is that when people are grieving, kind of uh, researcher David Eckert calls it our material convoy. Our stuff becomes like the things, the possessions that our deceased loved ones leave behind, can be a really stressful thing. And so one thing I've been doing is letting people tell me the story virtually. Like they're like, I don't want to let this go if I haven't, talked about it, or if I haven't, I don't want to give it to Goodwill without thinking about it. So even like setting up a virtual space to be like, I will just sit with you while you're in the room going through Simon's clothes. And so let's talk about what that brings up for you. So really just trying to be creative and present in ways that people need.
I love that, creative and presence. And I like what you said about ritual. So many of our rituals were upended in the last year, or in some cases, just erased, missed, grieved. Um, so I'm an Enneagram 3, which means I've got enough optimism to entitle this event the post-pandemic soul. And, and while we are certainly not post-pandemic, we are looking towards a world that will remember the pandemic and will grieve our experiences, and in some cases, memorialize those experiences. So we will probably also ritualize those experiences, I suspect. I'd love to hear about your expertise and kind of what you see looking out, Zeena. What rituals do we need to find and create and reimagine as we go forward?
Yeah. So one of the things that they have, it's a Medicare, Medicaid regulation, but that we do as hospice chaplains and bereavement coordinators is we do like a pre-bereavement assessment. So when a patient comes on service, how do we think the family system or the circle of support will grieve after their death? Of course, it's not an exact science. It's not like we're guessing, but there are little things that I've learned in this time that really determine how people grieve, like or can predict what the grief process will look like. And so they're everything from like what are the concurrent stressors that are happening in one's life. What does the support system look like? All of those kinds of like things. And when I look at our culture, we are not going to grieve well. I mean, when we look at it through that lens, because we have so many concurrent stressors going on. Another thing I look at is like the presence of other significant losses and how those have been grieved. And so you're looking at all those things. And so when I look at our society, I was just thinking if I had to do a pre-bereavement assessment on like our culture post-COVID, we are going to have lots of complicated and compounded grief because one of the things I say to a lot of my clients is that in order to grieve well, in lots of ways, we have to live well. And we have not been living well as a culture. And so all that to say, there's going to be a lot of complicated and compounded grief that we need to express. And so a study that I love is that that ritual doesn't have to be big or even it doesn't have to be religious. It was I think it was a Harvard sociology study that said people who have independent, secular, and personalized ritual tend to do better through the grief process than those who do not. And so they were saying anything from drinking out of a coffee cup that your loved one drank out before they died daily, or wearing a brooch every day, or walking through a garden that was tended by the person you love that died. And so I tend to think of ritual in these really small ways, but ways of acknowledging um, something that was here is gone. Something has shifted, something has changed, and trying to bridge those realities. And so I think a lot of our, how we'll be called to ritualize as a culture is just an acknowledgement. And I don't think we do well as I mean, I know we don't do well as a culture with kind of ambiguous loss and with like losses that we can't name. And I think we've been in the midst of a lot of those. Like we're just not able to name those. So I think even a powerful ritual will just be the naming of those that happen. And so just if we can name them in any way, and I also think grief needs to be witnessed. And so a powerful part of ritual will just be, and the witness doesn't have to be a huge hall, but like just having even a friend or a group. In my congregation, we have a spiritual practices group, and we just did this activity where we talked about things that we want to let go of, that the pandemic is helping us see that we need to just let go of completely. And it was so beautiful to have us all like we did the simple act of like thinking about the question for 5 minutes and writing it down and then sharing it. And everybody was like, oh, we needed that. And so it's just these really simple rituals of connection and witnessing that I think are so important for us.
I love that. I love that imagery of the simple things. And I also was captivated by what you said, Zeena, when you said that some things are going to have to go away for us to be able to truly move forward, to release some things. One of the things that 1128 is really passionate about is women in ministry. And there is, how to put this kindly, there are some things the church needs to let go of when it comes to the way in which women have been excluded, avoided, minimized with regards to specifically on staff, but of course at a much broader level as well. As you look at women in ministry and your passion for that and how you share some of that, tell me, if you could, in just a moment, what opportunities do we have to let go as a church of some of these habits, we'll call them, to put it kindly, with regards to how we have failed women?
Yeah, this is, I mean, in so many ways, this is such a personal question for me and something that I'm grappling with. So I graduated from seminary almost 10 years ago, and I did not pursue the ordination process at that time because I was told, like, as a woman, and then as a Black woman, like, you are not going to get called to a congregation. And so I was like, why am I going to go through this process if I'm not going to get a job? So, um, and so I became a chaplain, and I'm so glad that I did, but I am rethinking that now and beginning the ordination process all 10 years ago, 10 years out of seminary. And so in some ways, I really just wished as a seminarian, someone would have just asked me about that, or talked to me about that decision versus being like, yeah, that's the way it is. Or just even encouraged me to dream and kind of reimagine what a church would look like with me as a pastor. Um, and so I'm grateful for the path that I have taken, but I think Audre Lorde says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Um, and so I think about that quote a lot, but I think, what are the tools that we need to rebuild something? Because I think in a lot of ways, so much of what the pandemic has exposed is that we need to tear a lot of things down and restart. But I think the tearing down is scary, like, because I mean, it's like, what are we building? So I think right now, and I tend to be an optimist as well. I think now that we have the opportunity to reimagine some things and like just dream and vision. And so I think now is just giving ourselves the permission to say, this was really not good the way we looked at this. But what do we want to build in its place? What do we want to see happen? And that's a scary process, and it takes so much imagination, and it takes a lot of visioning. It takes a lot of getting out of our own way. It takes a lot of not needing to be perfect, like letting go of perfectionism, and letting go of, and just like, it's messy work to rebuild and reimagine. A tree fell on our house earlier in the pandemic, and so we had to rebuild that portion of our house, and so that's messy, long work that I've been in the midst of, but it's also beautiful, like, to see something come up in its place even better than what was raised. And so I think that's a lot of what we're called to do. Like, right now, we're in a dream space. Like, we're in a space where if we allow ourselves, we can just dream bigger and different dreams, not confined by old structures. And that's scary stuff, but it's also amazing. And it's such an invitation, more than anything.
I like that. The invitation to reimagine. So, Zia, the last question I have for you is, in your own words, what do you hope the church will reimagine with regard to its relationship with women?
Hmm. There is so many things that I hope will be reimagined. Um, but more than anything, I am really hoping that the church will reimagine its relationship to a male patriarchal God. Um, I want to, so I know that language can be so hard for people to let go of and trouble and like normalize, but I think our language captures so much of how we think about things. It's actually sitting on my desk. I've been reading this book, Prayer of the Cosmos, by Neil Douglas Klotz, and he argues that we miss so much of Jesus's words when we translate it into the English, because we do these really literal translations when the audiences where he was would have heard like things on a metaphysical and universal and just a poetic level. And so I've been so inspired by that work. It's been my like devotional lately to read some of that. But in reading his renderings and translations of the scripture, I'm like, what would it have been like to grow up with language for God other than he and him and father? And what would that have been for me as a little Black girl growing up in Anchorage, Alaska, to imagine that the God of the universe had image. I mean, like I knew I was created in God's image, but it was like God was this white man with a white beard, and so. But to reimagine that would have been amazing for me, and so so even that, like having new images of God and expansive. That's the word I always think of, like having really expansive, not necessarily, I mean, inclusive, but just big. Um, Images of how we imagine God. So I think that's such an opportunity for our churches. The church that I go to, they did like, and this was years ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they painted Jesus brown and it was a scandal, but it's like, how is that a scandal? Like Jesus was a Middle Eastern man, And so those kinds of things, like I think so much of I think we can be really captive by our language and our images. And so I think even just beginning to expand our ways of thinking can help expand our ways of knowing. And it can seem, and so for congregations that are still struggling or with calling a woman as a pastor, or seeing a woman as a leader and a teacher, I think when we expand our image of God and look at the giftings of God and the Spirit, it's just it provides so much opportunity to do a lot of revolutionary work.
Awesome. Thank you, Zeena, for those words. I appreciate it. Thank you for being a part of this conversation, both today and on the 11th. I really appreciate it. And may the God who nourishes children and gathers chicks go with you.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much.
You bet. All right. Excellent.